Hanford was never a town of great opportunity. A small industrial town with low wages and days as similar to each other as raindrops. Noma King knew that better than anyone. She'd grown up here, graduated from the local high school and then nursing college in a neighboring county. She'd returned to Hanford as a registered nurse and taken a job at the town's only clinic. At 28, Noma retained her youthful enthusiasm. She was short, with short-cropped hair and a broad smile, and she had a way with patients from the first minute. Colleagues appreciated her for her professionalism and willingness to fill in during a difficult shift. Noma had a way of finding common ground with everyone except her own husband. Elijah King was 3 years older than his wife, but sometimes it seemed that the difference between them was not years, but a whole era. Tall, sturdy, with a permanently intense gaze, he worked as a mechanic in an auto repair shop on the outskirts of town. His customers respected him for his ability to figure out any breakdown, but those close to him knew the other side of Elijah, the fiery and unpredictable one. They'd met 5 years ago at a barbecue at a mutual friend's house. Elijah was different then, smiling, attentive, making plans to open his own workshop. Noma fell in love with his confidence and ambition. They married a year later, bought a small house in the southern part of Hanford. The house was old, with a spacious basement, needed repairs, but they could afford it. The first 2 years of marriage seemed serene. They painted the walls together, changed the plumbing, went on picnics on weekends. But gradually something began to change. Elijah's own workshop remained a dream. Not enough money, then determination, then he just stopped talking about it. More and more often he came back from work irritated, picking on little things, criticizing Noma for any mistake. At first it was minor remarks. Then he began to control his wife's expenses, demanding an account for every dollar spent. Then came comments about her appearance, too bright lipstick, too short a dress. Friends started coming over less often. Elijah didn't hide his displeasure with the guests. "Are you deliberately making a fool of me in front of your co-workers?" he asked one day after her friend left work. "What do you mean?" Noma was genuinely surprised. All this talk about the hospital, about patients. "I'm a mechanic. I don't understand your medical terms. You want to show how smart you are." Noma learned to give in. She invited fewer friends over, kept an eye on the topics of conversation, tried not to provoke her husband. But Elijah's resentment only grew. By the end of the 3rd year of their marriage, control had turned into tyranny. Elijah checked her cell phone, demanded she answer it immediately, made a scene if she was late after work. "I was worried!" He'd yell when she returned 30 minutes later than usual because of a complicated patient. "You couldn't call? I thought something had happened to you." At such moments, he could grab her by the shoulders and shake her, as if trying to shake her out of her explanation. Then he'd apologize, promise not to do it again. And for a while, he really was the same old Elijah, caring, attentive. Noma wanted to believe that these were temporary difficulties, that things would get better. But with each passing month, the quiet periods grew shorter and the outbursts of anger stronger. Once, when she didn't return 3 of his calls during an emergency surgery, he broke her favorite vase. Another time, he threw away a dress he thought was too revealing. The first real thought of divorce came to her after their 4th wedding anniversary. They'd had dinner at a restaurant, the only time they'd gotten out together in a year. Elijah was in a good mood, joking with the waiter, giving her earrings. And then, at home, he'd made a scene because he thought she'd been flirting with the bartender. "I saw the way you looked at him." Elijah paced the living room. "You think I'm blind?" "I was just ordering drinks," Noma replied tiredly. Such scenes had become commonplace. "Don't lie to me!" He slammed his fist on the table, smiling at him, fixing his hair. She looked at his angry face and thought she no longer recognized the man she had married. Where had Elijah gone? The Elijah who had talked about love, made plans for the future. When had he been replaced by this jealous, controlling man who had turned their home into a prison? In recent months, Noma had begun to save money. Just a little, so her husband wouldn't notice. She considered her options, renting an apartment, staying with a friend, maybe even leaving Hanford. She hadn't told anyone about her plans, but the thought of divorce didn't seem as daunting as it had before. The fatal quarrel happened on a Wednesday, an ordinary weekday, nothing to portend trouble. Noma had come home from work later than usual. There had been an accident on the highway, and they'd brought in the injured. She hadn't alerted Elijah. Her phone had been dead since the afternoon. He was waiting for her in the living room. He was sitting in a chair without turning on the light. When she came in, flicked the light switch, Elijah didn't move. "Where have you been?" he asked in a voice so quiet that Noma felt a chill run down her spine. "At work. There were a lot of people injured in the accident," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "My phone was dead, so I couldn't call." Elijah rose slowly from his chair. "You're lying," he said in the same frighteningly quiet voice. "I called the hospital. You weren't there after 6. "What?" Noma was confused. "Of course I was there. Ask Kioma. We're together." "Shut up!" he suddenly shouted, and Noma instinctively took a step back. "I know everything. You're seeing someone. Who is he?" "There is no one." Noma felt her heart racing. "Elijah, please, let's just talk." "No more talking." He grabbed the picture frame off the table and threw it at the wall. The glass shattered. "I know you want to leave me. You think I don't see the way you look at other men? How you hide your phone when I walk in?" He was closing in on her, and Noma kept backing away until her back was against the wall. "I'm not going anywhere," she lied, hoping to calm him down. "Elijah, you're my husband. I love you." He stopped a step away from her. There was such cold fury in his eyes that Noma realized no words would help. "Do you think I'm a fool?" he asked quietly. "I saw your card statement. You're saving money. Are you going to run away? To him?" At that moment, Noma realized that she could no longer live in fear. "Yes, I want to leave," she said firmly, "but not to another man, just to leave you because you're not the man I married." For a second, Elijah stared at her in amazement, as if he couldn't believe she dared to say it out loud. Then his hand went to her throat. Noma tried to scream, but Elijah's fingers clamped down on her neck, cutting off the air. She clawed at his hands, tried to break free, but he was much stronger. Dark spots swam before her eyes, and the last thing she remembered was his face, distorted with rage, very close. Noma woke up on the living room floor. Her throat was sore, every breath coming in hard. Elijah was sitting next to her, holding a glass of whiskey. "I'm sorry," he said, noticing that she had regained consciousness. "I didn't mean to. You made me do it." Noma remained silent, afraid to provoke another outburst of anger. She sat up slowly, leaning against the wall. Her head was spinning. "I love you," Elijah continued in an almost normal voice. "I can't lose you. You're all I have." He reached out and stroked her hair. Noma barely suppressed the urge to recoil. "Let's go to bed," he said. "Tomorrow everything will be better, I promise." Noma didn't sleep a wink that night. She lay beside Elijah sleeping and thought she had to run now before he snapped again. In the morning, she'd say it was okay, that she understood him, and then, when he left for work, she'd pack the essentials and go to a friend's house in the next town. But in the morning, Elijah woke her up, brought her coffee in bed, and was unnaturally cheerful and alert. Said he'd gotten off work and wanted to spend the day with her. Noma had no choice. She had to call the clinic and tell them she was sick. All day long, he stayed with her every step of the way. Made breakfast, suggested we watch a movie. It's like nothing happened. Only the bruises on her neck reminded him of yesterday. In the evening, when Noma was washing the dishes after dinner, she heard Elijah going down to the basement. He didn't usually go down there. The damp room was used mostly for storing garden tools and old furniture. Noma didn't think much of it. Maybe he'd decided to do some long-promised repairs. The next 2 days passed in the same strange calm. Elijah was attentive, talking about plans for the future, even suggested having a child. Noma kept the conversation going, smiled, and thought about how to get out of this nightmare. The bruises on her neck began to fade, and she went back to work. Friday night, when she got home, Elijah met her with a bottle of wine. "I want to celebrate," he said, pouring the wine into glasses. "A new beginning for us." Noma took a sip, feeling a strange flavor. But Elijah stared so intently that she drank some more, not wanting to arouse suspicion. 20 minutes later, the room began to spin before her eyes. Her legs felt woozy, and her tongue refused to listen. What did you do?" She struggled to get up from the couch. Elijah caught her as she started to fall. "Shh, shh," he whispered. "It's going to be okay. You just get some sleep." The last thing Noma remembered was Elijah picking her up in his arms and carrying her somewhere. Then there was darkness. Cold. It was the first sensation when consciousness began to return, a piercing, pervasive cold that made her muscles cramp. Noma tried to move and realized she was lying on something hard and icy. She opened her eyes, and it was pitch black. She stretched her hand forward and stumbled on a smooth surface a few centimeters from her face. She tried to sit up and hit her head. An enclosed space. Noma began groping the walls around her, trying to figure out where she was. Smooth metal on all sides, cold as ice, and silence. Absolute, broken only by the sound of her own breathing. A sudden realization made her gasp in horror. The freezer! She's in the freezer! Panic struck instantly. Noma scrambled into the cramped space, pounding her hands on the lid, screaming, begging for help. But the lid wouldn't budge. Surely Elijah must have locked it from the outside. Elijah. Her husband locked her in the freezer. He wants to kill her. The thought made the cold seem even more piercing. Noma forced herself to breathe more slowly, fighting the panic attack. The nurse in her had taken over from the frightened woman. She had to think clearly if she wanted to survive. The first thing was to assess the situation. The freezer is large. She could lie stretched out to her full height. Noma immediately realized it was a new chest. They'd never had one in the house. There was a small freezer in the kitchen, where she could barely fit a week's worth of groceries, and the basement had no appliances at all, just Elijah's tool racks and boxes of seasonal items. Elijah had obviously bought this stall recently, especially for her. Now his trips to the basement took on a sinister meaning. He was preparing, planning her murder, setting up the freezer. There was still enough air, so the freezer wasn't airtight. That gave us some hope. But the temperature, -18 degrees at least. Without warm clothes, a person in such conditions could only last a few hours at most. And then a second wave of realization hit her, even more terrifying than the first. Even if she could somehow get out, Elijah would just finish what he'd started. In another way, he wouldn't let her go. Noma curled up in a ball, trying to keep warm. Her arms and legs were already starting to feel numb. Drowsiness is the first sign of hypothermia. Fight it, must fight sleep. In the pitch blackness, in the piercing cold, Noma King realized that from now on, every minute was a battle for life, and it was a battle she would have to fight alone. Darkness, cold silence. In the first hours, Noma balanced on the edge of panic and clarity of thought. Every breath burned her lungs, cold penetrated her skin, dug into her bones like 1,000 icy needles. Time stretched. It was impossible to tell how many minutes or hours had passed since she'd woken up in that metal coffin. Gradually, her eyes grew accustomed to the darkness. There was a faint glimmer of light through the thin gap between the lid and the body of the freezer, a lamp burning in the basement. It was enough to make out the outlines of the objects inside. Noma forced herself to proceed methodically. First, a full assessment of the situation. She slowly groped the inside of the freezer, a standard chest about 2 meters long and 80 centimeters wide, large enough for her to lie stretched out to her full height, but not fully unfolded. Inside were 2 metal baskets, standard equipment for such models. The lid was heavy and appeared to be locked from the outside. Noma pushed until her arms ached, but all she got was that the lid lifted a few millimeters, then hit something and wouldn't move. Elijah had thought of everything. After assessing her position, Noma moved on to assessing her own condition. She was wearing a tracksuit she'd just gotten back from a run when Elijah suggested a glass of wine. The warm fleece sweatshirt and pants offered some protection from the cold, but it was woefully inadequate in sub-zero temperatures. Luckily, I still had my running shoes and thick socks on my feet, which gave me a chance that my feet wouldn't freeze too quickly. Medical knowledge kicked in automatically. At a temperature of about -18 degrees, without special winter clothing, a person could die of hypothermia in 2 or 3 hours. If she wanted to survive, she needed to act now, while she still had clarity of thought. The most important thing was to keep warm. Noma removed the inner dividers from the baskets and stacked them on the bottom of the freezer, creating a little insulation from the icy metal. Then she curled up into a fetal position. That way, the area of contact between her body and the cold surface would be reduced. I pulled my knees to my chest, wrapped my arms around them, head down, covering her face. But it wasn't enough. The cold continued to suck out the vital warmth. Noma realized she couldn't stay like this much longer, and if she died, Elijah would dispose of the body, and no one would ever know what had happened. He'd tell everyone she'd left, abandoned him, maybe even fake a few texts from her phone. The crime would go unpunished. The thought made her act. If she doesn't survive, there has to be evidence. The kind that Elijah couldn't destroy, that would be revealed by even a cursory examination of the body. Noma groped the metal baskets, trying to find something sharp. Usually, such baskets are made of strong wire. If one managed to break off a piece or unscrew some fastener, one of the partitions in the basket was held on by a thin wire fastener. Noma began to swing it from side to side, feeling her fingers go numb from the cold. 20, 30, 40 strokes. The metal wouldn't budge. On the 50th movement, something clicked, and in her hand was a piece of wire about 10 centimeters long, with a sharp end where it broke off. Now it was necessary to choose a place for the message. It had to be prominent, but not so that Elijah would see it right away if he decided to check the body before disposing of it. Noma chose the inside of her left forearm, a noticeable enough area when inspecting the body, but one that could be covered with a sleeve if necessary. The cold dulled the pain as she brought the sharp end of the wire to her skin. The first letter was A. The metal scratched, but didn't cut deep enough into her skin. Noma pressed harder, overcoming the instinctive urge to yank her hand away. The skin gave way, and blood came out, quickly freezing in the cold. Letter by letter, she scratched out a message on her hand. Elijah killed me. Each movement became more and more difficult. Her fingers were almost unlistenable from the cold. The blood froze almost instantly, forming maroon crusts on the wounds. This is good, Noma thought. Even if the body is not found immediately, the inscription will remain legible. Finishing the gruesome inscription, she stashed the wire in her sweatshirt pocket. If Elijah looked in the freezer, there should be no obvious trace of her actions. Now, survival Noma's medical training gave her a slight advantage. She knew that in extreme cold, it was important to slow down the metabolism so the body used less energy and oxygen. Breathing should be slow and deep. No sudden movements that increase circulation and cause the body to lose heat faster. Heat. Noma concentrated on her breathing. Inhale, slowly counting to 4, delaying for 2 seconds. Exhale, again counting to 4. Repeat. This simple technique helped keep my mind clear and slightly reduced my oxygen consumption. Time stretched on endlessly. Without a watch, in total darkness, it was impossible to tell how many minutes or hours had passed. Periodically, Noma heard footsteps upstairs. Elijah was walking around the house. One day, she heard the sound of the television. Her husband lived a normal life while she slowly froze in the basement. Gradually, the drowsiness became overwhelming. Noma knew that this was a dangerous symptom. The body stopped fighting the cold, preparing for death. She pinched her cheeks, bit her lips, tried to move her fingers and toes to stay awake. But how long could one resist physiology? At some point, she did fall into a heavy, restless sleep. Waking up was agonizing. Her body stiffened, every movement causing sharp pain in her joints. Noma could not tell whether she had slept an hour or 10 hours, but she was still alive, and it felt like a small miracle. Her mouth was dry, dehydration, another enemy in this situation. A thin layer of frost had formed on the walls of the freezer. Noma began to pick it up with her tongue, turning the tiny ice crystals into water droplets. It was agonizingly slow, but even that little bit gave her hope of lasting a little longer. Several times she heard the door to the basement open. Footsteps on the stairs, then silence. Was Elijah checking on her, or was he just coming down for something else? Noma froze each time, afraid he'd open the freezer. What would she see in his eyes? Remorse? Not likely. More likely cold satisfaction that his plan was working. But the lid never opened. Footsteps receded, the door closed, and Noma was once again alone with the cold and darkness. By the end of the first day, if her sense of time was correct, Noma began to experience hallucinations. She thought someone was calling her name, that there was a little girl sitting in the corner of the freezer looking at her, that the walls were sliding apart, giving more space, and then contracting again, threatening to crush her. The rational part of the mind understood that it was hypothermia and oxygen deprivation affecting the brain. But knowing didn't take away the terror when ghostly figures appeared before her eyes or when she thought the freezer was filling with water. She began to talk to herself to keep her sanity. She remembered nursery rhymes, recipes, anatomical terms, anything that could keep her in touch with reality. Periodically, she checked the writing on her hand by running her fingers over it. The letters remained crisp, the frozen blood forming embossed lines. Even if she didn't survive, the truth would be known. On the second day, Noma assumed it had been about 24 hours, she noticed a strange thing. She wasn't so cold anymore. It was as if her body had adapted to the extreme temperature or simply lost the ability to feel cold. It was a dangerous sign. The body was giving up fighting, preparing for death. But Noma wasn't going to give up. She continued to breathe slowly and deeply, periodically rubbing her limbs to stimulate circulation. Picked frost off the walls to get some moisture, fighting the sleep that was becoming more and more seductive. Her thoughts often returned to Elijah. How could the man she had once loved turn into a monster? Was there some part of his soul that regretted what he was doing? Or had he completely convinced himself that she deserved to die this way? By the middle of the second day, she noticed that the faint light coming through the crack had changed angle. Perhaps there was a window in the basement, and she could see the change of day and night. This tiny connection to the outside world offered a strange comfort. Somewhere out there, beyond the walls of her icy prison, life went on. People were going to work, talking, laughing. The sun rose and set. In the evening, if it really was evening, she heard the phone ringing upstairs. Elijah's voice came muffled, but she could make out individual words. No, she had gone to visit relatives. Yeah, all of a sudden. I don't know when she'll be back. No, there's no answer on the phone. He was making an alibi, telling everyone she left of her own free will, maybe even texting from her phone to keep the story going, figuring out how to dispose of the body when it was all over. The thought gave Noma new strength. He must not escape his responsibility. She must survive to tell the truth. And if she didn't, the inscription left on her hand must speak for her. By the end of the second day, the hunger had become unbearable. Her stomach twisted in painful spasms. Her head was dizzy with weakness. But Noma knew that a person could survive for weeks without food, much longer than without water or in extreme cold. During the night, she heard footsteps in the basement again. This time they stopped very close to the freezer. Noma held her breath. Would Elijah follow his plan to the end? Or would he change his mind at the last moment, open the lid, let her live? Footsteps lingered by the freezer for a few seconds, then moved away. The cellar door closed. Noma exhaled with relief and disappointment at the same time. The third day was the hardest. The weakness had become almost insurmountable. Every movement required tremendous effort. Her lips were chapped from dehydration, her tongue swollen and barely moving in her mouth. Collecting frost from the walls became a real ordeal. His hands shook so violently that most of the precious crystals simply fell to the bottom of the freezer. The hallucinations became more frequent. Noma could now see her parents sitting next to her, saw Elijah smiling and holding out his hand, saw herself as a little girl running through a green meadow. The rational part of her mind still held a connection to reality, but it was growing weaker and weaker. Noma realized that if she didn't get help in the next few hours, she would die of dehydration or hypothermia. In the middle of the third day, by her senses, Noma noticed a strange thing. It became easier to breathe. It was as if more air was coming into the freezer. Could it be that some seal had been damaged by the cold? Or had her perception changed from exhaustion? She tried pushing the lid again and felt it give in a little more now than before. Not enough to get out, but enough to let in more air. That gave her hope of holding out a little longer. Now her efforts were focused on staying conscious. She pinched herself, biting the inside of her cheek, singing half-voiced children's songs. Anything to keep from succumbing to the seductive slumber that called to her more and more insistently. In the evening, she heard the front door slam. Then it was quiet. Elijah must have left the house, maybe to work or to the store, or maybe he'd started to create an alibi for when her body was discovered. In the silence of the empty house, Noma continued to fight for every minute of life. Her body gradually shut down system by system. First, her limbs lost sensation. Then her vision began to fail. Even in the dim light coming through the slit, she saw blurred outlines and strange flashes. Speech became slurred, even when she was talking to herself. Her thoughts were confused, jumping from one thing to another without logical connection. But in the midst of this chaos of fading consciousness, Noma clung to one thought. She must not give up. Must hold on a little longer, one more hour, one more minute. Because somewhere deep inside, there was hope that she would be found, that someone would notice the inconsistencies in Elijah's story, that someone would go down to the basement and hear her faint tapping on the freezer lid. And if hope fails, if this is truly the end, well, she's done her best. Her last message scratched on her hand will tell the truth. Elijah would not escape responsibility. With that thought, Noma continued to fight for every breath in her icy prison as the third day of her confinement came to an end. Noma's fourth day in the freezer began with absolute silence. Even her own breathing seemed distant, muffled, as if it came from somewhere outside her mind, drifted on the edge of reality and delusion. Her body, exhausted by the cold and dehydration, hardly obeyed the commands of her brain. She lay curled up in a fetal position, trying to retain the last crumbs of warmth. The hood of her sweatshirt was pulled over her head, her arms tucked into the sleeves, her knees pressed to her chest. But even in that position, the cold was finding its way to every cell in her body. Her lips were chapped and bleeding, her tongue swollen with thirst. The tips of her fingers and nose were desensitized, the early stages of frostbite. Every movement caused sharp pain in her joints, every breath burning her lungs with icy air. Noma tried to keep track of time, but it was getting harder and harder. Day and night merged into one endless torture of the cold. The occasional sounds from above, Elijah's footsteps, the sound of the television, the slamming of the front door, were the only reference points. At one point on the fourth day, she heard a strange sound from outside the freezer, as if someone was moving heavy objects. Then there were distant footsteps. After a while, the same sound repeated, Then, footsteps again. Maybe Elijah was moving something in the basement, preparing to dispose of her body. The thought broke through the fog in her head and made Noma check the writing on her hand again. Her fingers barely obeyed, but she fumbled with the embossed letters, "Elijah killed me." The frozen blood made the message distinct, as if burned into her skin. If she was found, the truth would come out. The hallucinations had become almost constant by the fourth day. They were so realistic now that Noma could no longer distinguish them from reality. She saw the freezer fill with warm water, felt it touch her skin, heard it splash, saw the lid open and her mother's face appear in the opening calling her name, saw the walls of the freezer become transparent, revealing a view of a sunny beach. In rare moments of lucidity, Noma realized it was all just the games of a dying brain, but rationality would give way to the visions, and she would sink back into their deceptive comfort. At some point, perhaps it was the middle of the fourth day, maybe it was the beginning of the fifth, Noma noticed a strange thing. She no longer felt cold. Instead, a pleasant warmth was spreading through her body, as if she were lying by a fireplace, wrapped in a soft blanket. Even the pain had receded, replaced by a peaceful numbness. Medical knowledge broke through the fog. This paradoxical undressing is the final stage of hypothermia, when the body shuts down its thermoregulatory mechanisms and the person feels hot. Many people who had frozen to death were undressed. In their last moments of life, they tore off their clothes, thinking they were too warm. Noma realized that this was a harbinger of the end, but at the same time, something in her medical training told her that this very condition could paradoxically save her life. In severe hypothermia, metabolism slows down so much that the body goes into a kind of hibernation mode. The need for oxygen and nutrients drops, and life processes are barely thawing. This is what sometimes allows people to survive after a long stay in icy water or under a snow avalanche. Noma decided not to fight the rolling drowsiness. This might be her only chance. She must conserve the rest of her energy, allow her body to go into a mode of minimal resource consumption. Consciousness was fading like an extinguished candle. Her last thought was, if she survived, she would tell the truth. If she died, the inscription on her hand would do it for her. Then came a darkness deeper than the one that had surrounded her in the freezer. A darkness without thought, without fear, without time. While Noma teetered on the brink of life and death, Elijah King continued to lead an ordinary life. He went to work, went out with friends, watched TV in the evenings. To everyone who asked about Noma, he told the same story. She suddenly left for relatives with whom he did not know, said that she needed time to think about their relationship. No, he does not know when she will return. Yes, of course, he is worried. That's the story Jamal Osei, the king's neighbor, heard. The 35-year-old bus driver lived across the street and occasionally had a word with Elijah and Noma. He wasn't a close friend of the family, but like everyone in the small neighborhood, he knew the neighbors well enough. Jamal met Elijah on the evening of the fourth day while taking out the trash. He was returning from work, and they exchanged the usual greetings. "How's Noma?" Jamal asked. "I haven't seen her in a while." "She's gone to visit relatives," Elijah answered with a strained smile. "Said she needed to clear her head." "Trouble?" Jamal wasn't nosy by nature, but something in his neighbor's tone made him uneasy. "Nothing serious," Elijah shrugged. "You know how it is. Women need space sometimes." They parted ways, but the brief conversation left Jamal with a strange feeling. Something was wrong. In the 3 years the Kings had lived in the neighborhood, he'd never seen Noma go anywhere alone. Elijah had always been there for her, sometimes too intrusive. And then, did Noma have any relatives? He vaguely remembered a conversation with her last summer when she'd mentioned that she'd grown up in an orphanage. The next morning, the 5th day of Noma's confinement, Jamal walked his Labrador Rex before work. Rex wasn't just a pet. Until his retirement 2 years ago, he had served in search and rescue. participating in operations to find people under rubble and in the woods Jamal had taken him in when the dog was written off due to age. But Rex retained all his skills. They were passing the King house when the dog suddenly stopped and tensed. His nostrils flared, his ears stood erect. Then he made a stand, looking up at the basement window of the house, and whined softly. "What is it, Rex?" Jamal pulled on the leash, but the dog didn't move. Instead, it began to tear toward the house, whining softly, the way it had once signaled people it had found. Jamal frowned. Rex's behavior was unmistakable. There was a person in trouble somewhere nearby. He led the dog closer to the house. Rex pulled him right up to the basement window, which was slightly ajar, unusual for the cold season. "Is someone there, boy?" Jamal asked, and the dog whined again, looking at his master with intelligent brown eyes. The alarm was growing. Jamal listened, leaning against the window. At first there was silence, then he thought he heard a faint sound, either a groan or a creak. Too quiet to be sure. He straightened up, contemplating what to do. Maybe it doesn't mean anything. Maybe Elijah had something stored in the basement that had caught the dog's attention. But Rex kept insistently pulling at the window, and Jamal knew his dog was never wrong. He decided to take action. There was still time to work, so he took Rex home and walked back to the King house. Knowing Elijah had already left for work, Jamal went to the front door and rang the bell. No answer, as he expected. He then walked around the house and stopped at the basement window. The frame was old, and with a little effort, the window opened wider. Jamal turned on the flashlight on his phone and shone it inside. The basement was just like a basement. Racks of tools, boxes, gardening equipment. But in the far corner stood a large white freezer that hadn't been here before. Jamal was sure of it. He'd helped Elijah move the bikes down here for winter storage a few months ago, and he remembered well that no freezer had been in the basement then. Something about this picture disturbed him. He listened again, and now he could clearly hear a faint thumping sound coming from inside the cellar. Rhythmic, as if someone were faintly striking metal. There was no longer any doubt. Jamal climbed through the window and jumped into the basement. The sound grew more distinct as he approached the freezer. It came from inside, intermittent and barely audible. With his heart pounding, Jamal approached the chest. A heavy toolbox rested on top of the lid, obviously to keep it from opening from the inside. He pushed the box aside and pulled the lid up. Cold air hit him in the face. At first, Jamal couldn't realize what he was seeing. In the freezer lay a curled body covered in frost. Only when he leaned closer did he recognize Noma. Her skin was bluish white, her lips cracked, her eyes closed. She looked dead. But at the same moment, Jamal noticed that her chest was barely perceptibly rising. She was still breathing. "Jesus! Noma!" he exhaled, unable to believe his eyes. Acting on instinct, Jamal bent down and gently lifted her out of the freezer. Her body was icy to the touch, stiff like a frozen fish. He laid Noma on the basement floor, took off his jacket and covered her, trying not to make any sudden movements. He'd heard somewhere that you couldn't warm a person quickly if they were severely hypothermic. Then he pulled out his cell phone and dialed emergency services. 911, what's your emergency? A woman's voice answered the phone. "I need an ambulance," Jamal blurted out. "My neighbor. She was locked in the freezer. I don't know how long. She's barely breathing." He gave the address and listened to the dispatcher's instructions. "Don't move the victim. Monitor her breathing. Don't give her anything to drink or eat. Wait for the medics to arrive." Then Jamal leaned toward Noma again. Her eyes were still closed, her breathing barely perceptible. But she was alive, and that seemed like a true miracle. Not more than 10 minutes had passed when he heard the sirens of an ambulance pulling up. Jamal rushed upstairs to meet the paramedics at the entrance. 2 paramedics, a man and a woman, quickly descended into the basement with stretchers and equipment. They examined Noma professionally, checked her pulse and breathing, and hooked up a portable monitor. "Severe hypothermia," the female paramedic said. "Body temperature about 28 degrees. Dehydration, probably frostbite to the extremities." "But she's alive," her colleague replied, setting up an IV. "That's pretty damn amazing. How long was she in there?" "I don't know," Jamal replied. Her husband told everyone that she'd gone to stay with relatives, maybe 4 or 5 days ago. The paramedics exchanged incredulous glances. 5 days in the freezer? The man shook his head. "Impossible." "Let's ask her when she wakes up," the woman said practically. "Right now, we need to get her to the hospital. Every minute counts." They carefully moved Noma onto the stretcher, wrapping her in special thermal blankets. Jamal noticed strange red lines on the inside of her left arm, but didn't have time to see what they were. As the medics prepared Noma for transportation, he asked, "Will she survive?" "It's hard to say," the female paramedic replied. "But she has a chance. It's good you found her." They carried the stretcher upstairs. Jamal followed them, dialing the police. What happened was clearly no accident. Someone had deliberately locked Noma in the freezer, and that someone was obviously her husband. The neighbors had already gathered outside, attracted by the sound of sirens. They watched in bewilderment and horror as paramedics loaded the stretcher with the motionless body into the ambulance. "What happened?" they asked Jamal. "Elijah locked Noma in the freezer," he answered, still in disbelief. "She'd been in there for days." There were cries of shock and disbelief all around. Some suggested finding Elijah immediately. Others asked how Jamal had found Noma. But he didn't have time to answer questions. He wanted to go to the hospital, make sure Noma was going to be okay. Besides, the police would probably want his statement. The ambulance left with its siren on. A few minutes later, 2 police cars showed up. Jamal briefly explained the situation to the officers, one of whom went straight to the machine shop where Elijah worked. The other stayed behind to survey the scene and interview the neighbors. Jamal was allowed to drive to the hospital, but was asked to remain available for further questions. He got into his car and followed the ambulance, still trying to make sense of what had happened. There was a controlled commotion in the hospital's emergency room. Noma was immediately taken to the intensive care unit. Jamal remained in the hallway, unsure of what to do next. After a while, a nurse approached him. "Are you a relative?" she asked. "No, a neighbor. I found her." "I see. The doctors are working on her now. She's critical, but stable." "Is she gonna make it?" Jamal asked again. The nurse hesitated to answer. "We're doing everything we can. Her body has gone through a severe shock, but she is young and apparently very strong. That she survived at all under these conditions is bordering on miraculous." She asked him to fill out some forms with information he knew about Noma, then suggested he wait in the waiting room. Jamal sat down on a plastic chair and covered his face with his hands. The events of the last few hours seemed unreal, like footage from a horror movie. How could a man do this to his own wife? And how could Noma survive in the freezer for 5 days? At that moment, there were loud voices in the hallway. Jamal looked up and saw 2 police officers ushering Elijah King into the emergency room. His hands were handcuffed behind his back, his face contorted with rage. "I want to see my wife," he shouted. "Where is she? What have you done to her?" One of the officers answered him something in a quiet but firm voice. Elijah fell silent, his gaze wandering down the hallway until it stopped on Jamala. Recognition flashed in his eyes, then rage. "You!" Dash, he hissed. "You're the one who got her? You prying into other people's business." The cops dragged him away to another part of the hospital, where they apparently planned to continue the interrogation. Jamal remained seated, shocked by the outburst. There was no remorse in Elijah's words, only anger that his plan had failed. Time dragged agonizingly slow. Jamal tried several times to inquire about Noma's condition, but the nurses could only say that the doctors were still fighting for her life. He called work to explain his absence, answered questions from the police, and drank tasteless hospital coffee from a vending machine. Finally, after several hours, the doctor, a dark-skinned, middle-aged woman with tired but lively eyes, approached him. "Are you the neighbor who found the patient?" she asked. Jamal nodded, afraid of hearing the worst. "My name is Dr. Kioma Easy," she introduced herself. "I'm handling Mrs. King's case. I want to tell you that you saved her life. A few more hours and it would have been too late." "How is she?" Jamal breathed a sigh of relief. "Her condition remains critical, but we've stabilized her body temperature and dealt with the most urgent problems. She has severe dehydration, frostbite on her limbs, and possible damage to her internal organs from prolonged exposure to the cold. But the important thing is that she is alive and fighting." The doctor was silent for a moment, then added more quietly, "The police want to know if she can be questioned, but I told them that's not possible in the next few days. She is unconscious and will probably stay that way for some time." "But she will recover?" Jamal insisted. "We're doing everything we can," Dr. Ease repeated the standard phrase. Then, after a pause, she added in a more personal tone, "You know, in my practice, I've never seen a person survive after 5 days in minus 18 degrees. The fact that she's still alive is incredible. So yes, she has a good chance of getting better." She was about to leave, but Jamal remembered something else. "Doctor, there were some strange markings on her arm. Did you see them?" Dr. Easy hesitated, as if deciding whether to share this information. "Yes," she finally said. On the inside of her forearm was an inscription made with some kind of sharp object. "Elijah killed me." The police had already photographed it as evidence. Jamal nodded, feeling a chill run down his back. Noma knew she might not survive and had left a message that couldn't be destroyed or hidden. Even in this icy trap, she was fighting not only for her life, but for justice. "Thank you for saving her," he said. "You saved her?" Dr. Easy smiled. "I'm just doing my job." She left, and Jamal remained in the hallway, staring at the closed doors of the ICU, behind which Noma King continued her fight for life. A fight she was, against all the laws of nature, winning so far. The intensive care unit at Hanford Hospital buzzed like a beehive. The medical staff paced around Noma King's motionless body. Dr. Kioma Eze, head of the department, personally supervised all procedures. The case was unique. A patient who had spent 5 days in a freezer was still clinging to life. "The current body temperature is 32.3, the nurse reported. Her heart rate was stabilizing but still arrhythmic. Kioma nodded, studying the readings on the monitors. When Noma had first been brought in, her body temperature had been only 27 degrees. Profound hypothermia, incompatible with life with prolonged exposure. That she survived was a medical mystery in itself. "Begin phase 2 of warming," Kioma ordered. "Warm saline intravenously, continue oxygen therapy." Warming in severe hypothermia required special care. Raising the temperature too quickly could cause cardiac arrhythmias or reperfusion injury, when blood suddenly rushes to cold tissues, causing swelling and damage. While examining the patient, Kioma noticed strange markings on the inside of her left forearm. Looking closer, she realized with horror that they were not random scratches. It was an inscription scratched with a sharp object. "Elijah killed me." "Call the police," she said quietly to the nurse. "And bring a camera. We need to get this into evidence." As the staff continued to work on stabilizing Noma, Kioma reflected on what this woman had been through. What courage and presence of mind one must have to think of evidence under such circumstances. The inscription had obviously been done deliberately, with full knowledge that it might be the only evidence if she didn't survive. An hour later, Detective Tahira Ngozi arrived at the hospital, a tall, statuesque woman with a penetrating gaze and restrained manners. She was referred to Dr. Ease, who showed her the inscription on the patient's arm and told her about Noma's condition. 5 days in the freezer? Tahira questioned, not hiding her surprise. How is that possible? We don't fully understand it ourselves, Chioma admitted. According to our preliminary estimates, the freezer she was in was not working properly. Instead of a constant temperature of -18 degrees, it probably heated up to -8 or even -5 intermittently. That might have given her a chance. The malfunction saved her life, Tahira said thoughtfully. Exactly. And, oddly enough, hypothermia played a protective role in her case. When your body temperature drops that low, your metabolism slows down, and your need for oxygen and nutrients decreases. It's similar to the hibernation state in some animals. Under normal conditions, movement helps keep her warm, but with prolonged exposure to extreme cold without access to food and water, it was the transition into this slowing down state that may have helped her survive. Tahira photographed the writing on Noma's arm, then scrutinized the rest of her body, looking for other signs of abuse. There were faint signs of bruising on her neck, possibly from strangulation. There were scuff marks on her wrists, as if from ropes or handcuffs. Can you tell when she regains consciousness? The detective asked. It's hard to say, Chioma replied. Her body has been under tremendous stress. She's in a medically induced coma to reduce the brain's metabolic demands. We may begin to bring her out of it in a few days, but it all depends on the dynamics of her recovery. Tahira nodded, making notes in her notebook. The husband is already in custody, she said. Their house is being searched now. I want to talk to the neighbor who found Mrs. King and then question the suspect. The neighbor should be in the waiting room, Chioma prompted. Jamal Osei. He hasn't left since she was brought in. Tahira thanked the doctor and headed to the waiting room. There, she found Jamal, a stout man with a concerned expression on his face. He told her in detail how his dog had sensed something wrong outside the King house, how he'd found Noma in the freezer and called an ambulance. Elijah told everyone that she had gone to stay with relatives, Jamal finished his story. But I remember Noma once mentioned that she'd grown up in an orphanage and had no family. That's an important detail, Tahira noted. Did you ever notice any signs of violence in their relationship? Jamal hesitated. Not that there were any overt ones. But Elijah had always been controlling. Noma was rarely alone. He was always there for her. And a couple times I saw him grab her arm on the street rather roughly, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Tahira wrote down this statement, thanked Jamal, and went to the police station where Elijah King was being held. The interrogation room was small and impersonal, gray walls, a metal table, 3 chairs. Elijah sat with his arms crossed over his chest, a look of offended dignity on his face. Next to him was his court-appointed attorney, a young man with tired eyes and a shabby briefcase. Mr. King, Tahira began, turning on the recorder. Do you understand why you're being detained? Some kind of misunderstanding. Elijah shrugged. My wife is in the hospital, and I'm being accused of something I don't understand. Your wife was found in a freezer in the basement of your house, Tahira answered coldly, where she had spent, according to preliminary estimates, about 5 days. This is not a misunderstanding, Mr. King. This is attempted murder. Elijah laughed uncertainly. Are you serious? I have no idea how she got in there. Maybe she climbed in by herself. And locked the lid from the outside? And put a heavy toolbox on top? Look, Elijah leaned forward. I love my wife. Why would I hurt her? We've had our little disagreements, like any couple, but nothing serious. Then explain why you told everyone that she had gone to her relatives when she had none, and why she has Elijah killed me scratched on her arm. This statement knocked Elijah off balance for a moment. He turned pale and looked at his lawyer, who whispered something in his ear. She must have done it herself to set me up, he finally said. Noma had always been emotional. Maybe she'd gone down to the basement at night to check the freezer, accidentally fell in, and the lid slammed shut. And she decided it was my fault. Tahira raised an eyebrow skeptically. Mr. King, we have witnesses who confirm that you told them about your wife's alleged departure to relatives. How do you explain that if you didn't know she was in the freezer? Elijah squirmed in his chair. She did say she wanted to leave. We had an argument. I thought she did. And you didn't worry when she didn't come back for 5 days? Didn't try to contact her? Report her missing? Yeah, I thought she needed space, time to think. Tahira watched him silently, letting the awkward silence work for her. Elijah squirmed in his chair. I want another lawyer, he said abruptly, and I won't say anything else without one. That's your right, Tahira nodded. But keep in mind, the forensic team is scrutinizing your house right now. If there's even the slightest evidence to support your wife's version of events, we'll find it. While Elijah remained in custody, the forensics team did indeed work on the King house. They uncovered several important clues. First, traces of sleeping pills were found on an empty wine bottle on the kitchen table. Secondly, in the bedroom under the bed, they found a box with several packages of the same sleeping pills. Thirdly, on the railing of the stairs leading to the basement, microfibers of fabric from Noma's tracksuit were found, evidence that she had probably been carried unconscious. But the most important evidence was Noma's smartphone, found in Elijah's desk drawer. Tahira personally went through the message history and found several texts sent after Noma was presumably locked in the freezer. They were all addressed to coworkers and a friend and contained roughly the same text. I need time to think. Went to my aunt's. We'll contact you when I'm ready. By matching the timing of the messages to Elijah's work schedule, investigators determined that he was likely sending them himself, creating a digital alibi for his wife. On the third day after Noma's rescue, Dr. Kioma Ease began gradually bringing her out of her induced coma. The process was slow. The brain, which had survived severe hypothermia, needed special care in returning to normal activity. By the evening of the fourth day, Noma moved her fingers slightly for the first time. This caused a surge of optimism among the medical staff. By the morning of the fifth day, she was responding to her voice, although her eyes remained closed. Noma, can you hear me? Kioma asked, leaning over to the bedside. If so, shake my hand. A weak, barely perceptible shake was the best response she could hope for. You're in the hospital. You're safe. You're going to be fine. On the sixth day, Noma finally opened her eyes. Her gaze was cloudy, unfocused, but she could already read the realization in it. She tried to say something, but only a faint croak escaped her parched throat. Don't try to speak. Kioma stopped her gently. You have a tube in your throat to help you breathe. We'll remove it soon if your vitals are stable. Noma blinked slowly in understanding. After another day, the breathing tube was removed, and Noma was able to speak her first words. They were barely audible, but distinct. Elijah, he tried to kill me. We know, Kioma replied, handing her water through a straw. The police have already taken him into custody. You have nothing to worry about. On the ninth day, Noma's condition improved enough that Detective Tahira was allowed a brief interrogation. She entered the room with a small tape recorder and a notepad. Mrs. King, I'm Detective Tahira Ngozi, she introduced herself. How are you feeling? Like I've been to hell and back, Noma smiled weakly. But it's getting better every day. I need to ask you some questions about what happened. Are you ready? Noma nodded. Her voice was still hoarse, but strong enough to tell her story. She described how Elijah had become more and more controlling and aggressive in recent months, how he'd strangled her after she'd confessed she wanted to leave, how he'd put something in her wine, and then she'd woken up in the freezer. I realized he wanted to kill me, Noma said, and that if I died, no one would ever know the truth. So I decided to leave proof. I found a piece of wire from the basket and scratched the inscription on my arm. A very brave thing to do, Tahira said. It was survival instinct, Noma shrugged, wincing at the pain in her frostbitten joints. I couldn't let him get away with it. Tahira took down her statement, asked a few more clarifying questions, and then informed her that based on that statement and the evidence gathered, the prosecutor would charge Elijah with attempted murder and unlawful imprisonment. He faces 15 years to life in prison, she added. Given the nature of the crime and the fact that it was carefully planned, I think the sentence will be closer to the maximum. After the detective left, Noma lay staring at the ceiling for a long time. The thought of Elijah spending decades in prison brought no satisfaction, only a strange desolation. How could the man she'd once dreamed of living her whole life with turn into a monster willing to kill her in such a brutal way? In the days that followed, Jamal Osei visited Noma regularly. At first, he felt awkward. After all, they were just neighbors, not close friends. But gradually, a simple, comfortable friendship developed between them. Jamal told her about what was going on in the neighborhood, brought her books, once even brought his dog Rex, who was allowed a short visit because of his status as a former service dog. If it weren't for Rex, I never would have thought to check the basement, Jamal admitted. He's the one who sensed you were there. Then I owe my life to you and your dog. Noma smiled, scratching Rex lightly behind the ear. She was still struggling to move. The frostbite on her fingers required long-term therapy. In the third week after Noma's rescue, Elijah was formally charged by the court. The hearing caused a great outcry in Little Hanford. Many residents of the town came to the court to show support for Noma. Dr. Kioma acted as an expert witness, confirming that the patient's injuries and condition were entirely consistent with her version of events. Elijah continued to deny his guilt, but his version of events was so implausible and the evidence against him so compelling that the court denied bail. He remained in custody, pending a full trial. By the end of the month, Noma's physical condition had improved significantly. She was already able to walk independently, albeit with the help of a walker. Her hands were slower to recover. The frostbite on her fingers was severe. Kioma warned that full recovery could take up to a year, and some of the effects would probably last a lifetime. But you are young and strong, she added with a smile. Your body has already proven that it can do wonders. The day she was discharged from the hospital, Noma stood at the window of her room, looking out at the green trees in the yard. The thought of returning to the house where everything had happened was unsettling, but there was no need to stay in the hospital any longer. Are you ready? Chioma asked, entering the room with the discharge papers. I'm not sure, Noma answered honestly. I don't know where to go. I'm definitely not going back to that house. I have a suggestion, said Kioma. My sister rents a small apartment not far from here. It's nothing fancy, but it's clean and cozy. You can live for free for the first month, and then we'll see. Noma gratefully accepted the offer. A few hours later, she was standing on the doorstep of her new temporary home, a small but bright apartment on the second floor of an old but well-maintained house. This is a new beginning, Kioma said as she handed her the keys. Many in your position would not have survived, not only physically but mentally. The fact that you're here speaks to your incredible fortitude. Noma smiled, feeling a strange mixture of emotions. Gratitude, relief, residual fear, and somewhere deep inside, the first sprouts of hope. Thank you, she said simply, for everything. That evening, sitting at the window of her new apartment, Noma pondered what lay ahead. Long physical rehabilitation, therapy to overcome her psychological trauma, Elijah's trial. The road would be long and arduous, but she'd already survived 5 days in a freezer. After that, no trial seemed insurmountable. As Kioma had said, it was a new beginning, and Noma was ready to take the first step.